Hello everyone. Today we're starting with a moving story about love, loss, and redemption in the American West. It's the journey of James, an Apache man who lost everything and was left to die, and Belle, a strong woman carrying her own scars from the past. Fate brings them together through rescue, struggle, and the courage to stand against old enemies until they discover hope and a new beginning. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see people joining us from all around the world. Now, let's begin this journey together. The desert has its own way of deciding who lives and who dies. Out there under the blistering sun, mercy is a rare thing, and water is rarer still. Belle Dawson had grown up learning both lessons well. She was 29 now, the daughter of a country doctor who had taught her about healing wounds and setting bones, about which herbs cooled a fever and which ones would make a horse sleep. Her mother had died when Belle was a child, and her father had passed just a year ago, leaving her alone in a weather-worn cabin high in the Mule Mountains. Belle had been riding her grey mule that morning, the sun not yet at its full burn, a rifle strapped across her saddle, and a pair of canvas saddlebags heavy with plants she'd been collecting along the creek. She liked the solitude, the scents broken only by cicadas and the crunch of her mule's hooves on the gravel wash. But as she passed near the ruins of an abandoned village, a place where prospectors had once struck, fool's gold before vanishing back east, she heard a sound that did not belong to stone or wind. It was a groan faint, ragged, more like the last breath of a dying man than the voice of someone still in this world. Belle reined in hard. She had been taught to mind her own business on the frontier because some cries for help were traps. Still, her father's voice seemed to stir inside her. You don't walk away from the dying if your hands can help. She slid off the mule, rifle ready, and moved toward the sound. The village was nothing but hollow shells of adobe and weather-split boards, tumbleweeds pushing through the cracks. In the largest open yard she saw him. A man was lashed to a post with rawhide strips. His head sagged against his chest, black hair hanging in dusty strands across his face. His skin was burned raw by the sun. Lips cracked and bleeding. His chest rose only in shallow jerks like a fire about to go out. Belle's breath caught. It was Apache. She could tell by the copper of his skin, the braids tied with bits of colored cloth, the tattooed marks faint along his arm. Every settler in Arizona territory knew to fear the Apache. Yet what she saw was not a warrior, but a man abandoned to die like an animal. She stepped closer. His wrists were raw, where the leather had chewed his flesh. Flies buzzed around him. Someone had left him here deliberately, not to kill cleanly, but to let dust and sun do the work. Belle licked her dry lips. Part of her said, "Turn back." This wasn't her fight. But another part, the part her father had raised, told her there was no choice. "Hold still," she whispered, though he was barely conscious. She pulled the hunting knife from her belt and sawed through the binding. The rawhide gave with a jerk. The man slumped forward, his weight nearly toppling her. She caught him under the arms. He muttered something in Apache low, broken syllables she couldn't understand, and then went limp. "Lord, help me," Belle muttered, straining to haul him upright. It was heavier than he looked, all lean muscle under battered skin. She dragged him step by step to where her mule waited, the beast stamping impatiently. Somehow she heaved him across the saddle, draping him like a sack of grain, then tied him down so he wouldn't fall. The ride home was long and slow. The mule picked its way up the rocky trail into the hills while Belle walked beside it, one hand steadying the stranger's limp body. The sun climbed higher, beating on her shoulders. But she didn't stop. She kept glancing at him, worried she was carrying only a corpse. At last the cabin came into sight. A small place of weather-worn logs with a crooked stone chimney and a patch of garden barely alive in the dust. Belle led the mule into the yard, untied the stranger, and wrestled him inside onto the narrow cot that had once been her father's. The first thing she did was fetch water from the rain barrel. She trickled it between his cracked lips, careful not to choke him. His throat worked feebly, swallowing. She soaked cloths and laid them across his forehead, then checked the wounds on his wrists and ribs. Bruises bloomed dark under his skin, and a gash along his side had gone foul. Belle set to work like her father had taught her. She brewed willow bark for fever, mashed pack into the cut, and stitched the edges closed with needle and thread. Her hand steady though her heart raced. She talked to him as she worked, not because he could understand, but because silence was heavier than she could bear. You're not dying on me, stranger. Not after I dragged you up that mountain. You hear? The man stirred once, his eyes flickering open. They were dark, sharp as obsidian, even in fever. He looked at her as though from another world, whispered something she couldn't catch, then fell back into unconsciousness. Throughout the night, Bal kept watch. She wiped sweat from his brow, kept the fire low, measured his breathing. At some point, exhaustion claimed her. She sat at the table, head pillowed on her arms, and drifted into uneasy sleep. James, though she did not yet know his name, drifted deeper. Fever carried him into the past. He saw again the riverbank where his people had camped. His wife laughing as their little boy splashed in the shallows. He smelled the moss quiet smoke of cooking fires. Felt the warmth of belonging. Then the thunder of hoofs shattered it all. Soldiers stormed through the camp with rifles blazing. Screams split the morning. He had run, fought, but when the smoke cleared, his world was nothing but ash. He jolted awake with a gasp, tears hot in his eyes. The ceiling above him was wood, not sky tall. His chest ached, his wrists throbbed. Then he saw her. A woman slumped over the table. A lamp casting a warm glow on her face. Stray strands of brown hair fell across her cheek. She was sleeping lightly, a knife still at her hip. It shifted and pain ripped through his side. Egranit. She startled awake, eyes flying open. For a moment, fear flickered there, then softened when she saw he was awake. Easy, she said, her voice low but steady. You're see fear. Don't be afraid. He won't harm you. James lay back staring at this strange woman who had cut him free when others had left him for dead. He did not understand why. Yet something inside him, long frozen, stirred faintly like a cold, remembering how to glow. For 2 days the man drifted between silence and fevered murmurs. Bale tended him with all the stubborn patience she had. She ground willow bark until her hands ached. Changed the bandages when they stuck, coaxed spoonfuls of broth into him, drop by drop. Sometimes he spoke in Apache, his words carrying a weight she couldn't grasp. Once in the middle of the night, she thought she heard a child's name whispered like a prayer. When at last the fever broke, he woke clearer. His eyes followed her as she poured water into a cup and lifted it to his lips. He drank greedily, then coughed, then tried again. Slow, she said softly. You'll make yourself sick. He studied her with weary eyes. His voice came rough as sand. Why, help me. The words were broken, but English all the same. Belle hesitated. No one had asked her that yet, not even herself. She thought of the moment in the ghost village, the rawhide biting into his wrists. She thought of her father, who had once mended a wounded mescalero boy while neighbors threatened to burn his barn for it. Because you were dying, she answered simply. And because I could. He stared at her for a long moment, then gave the faintest nod, as though he couldn't argue with that. By the week's end, he was able to sit up. His body still bore the punishment of who-knit rope, but strength returned slowly. Bal gave him space, watching him test his limbs like a wolf fresh from a trap. He pointed to himself one evening, tapping his chest. James, he said. James, Bal repeated. He nodded. His Apache name carried more syllables she couldn't pronounce, but this was the name he offered her. Well then, James, she said, trying the sound. I'm Bill. The faintest ghost of a smile touched his lips. Bill. It was the first time she'd heard warmth in his voice. Trust, though, did not come quickly. One afternoon, she found him standing unsteadily by the doorframe, gazing out at the canyon beyond. She hurried to steady him, but he pulled away. Go, he rasped, shaking his head. I'll leave. You can't, Bal protested. You're too weak. You kill yourself. His eyes hardened. Not stay with white woman. Bege's jaw tightened. She wanted to be angry, but instead she saw the shadows in his eyes. To him. She was not just Bal. She was the face of the people who had burned his home, left him tied to that. "You don't have to trust me," she said finally. "But I'm not your enemy." James said nothing, but that night he ate the stew she set before him without protein zest. It was a small victory. Little by little, their silence turned into words. James knew enough English to piece together meaning, and Belle picked up a few Apache phrases he offered grudgingly. It taught her to for water, day for night. She corrected his English gently when he asked. They began to share more. Belle told him about her father, how he'd been the only doctor for miles, riding out in storms to deliver babies or patch bullet wounds. She told him about her mother, who had died when Belle was just 7, and about the loneliness that followed. James listened in quiet, his gaze steady. At last, one night, as firelight flickered over the cabin walls, he spoke of his own past. "I had wife," he said haltingly, eyes on the flames. "Son, 6 winters, strong fast." His mouth tightened. "Soldiers came. Kill many. I fight. Not enough, my boy." He stopped, throat working. "Ye." Belle reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his scarred wrist. He did not pull away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He met her eyes. In that look, she saw more grief than she had ever known, but also something else, an ember of endurance that had not yet been snuffed out. As spring light softened the days, James grew stronger. He began to rise early, insisting on working. Despite Belle's protests, he mended the cabin's leaking roof, his hands deft with wood and rawhide. He cut new poles for the corral, repaired the stovepipe that had smoked for months. Belle watched with a strange stirring in her chest. For the first time since her father's death, the house felt alive again, as though someone besides her cared whether it stood or fell. In return, she showed James her herb garden, half wilted in the rocky soil. He knelt, touched the leaves, and shook his head. Too much sun. Need shade. He built a screen of branches that kept the plants alive. One evening, as they rested by the door, Belle said quietly, "You've done more for this place in a week than I managed in months." James' gaze slid to her. "Repay debt." "It's more than that." He tilted his head. "Why, you say?" She hesitated, then gave a wry smile. "Because my husband left me once. Say that wasn't enough for him. Since then, I've felt like nothing I did was worth much." James' eyes softened. He considered her words carefully before answering. "You strongly, but not broken. That is worth more than men who leave." Belle laughed, but the sound carried more release than mirth. "You don't know how long it's been since I heard anything kind." He held her gaze. "Truth is not kindness. Truth is truth." Her smile faded into something deeper, steadier. She realized then that this man, who had lost more than she could imagine, was giving her back a piece of herself she'd thought gone forever. Nights grew easier. Belle no longer locked the cabin door when she slept, and James no longer kept the knife within reach of his pillow. They ate meals side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes with halting conversation that grew richer each day. One night, Belle noticed him looking at the stars from the porch, his face lifted to the endless sky. "What do you see up there?" she asked. He thought a long moment before replying. "My people say stars are campfires of ancestors. They watch us." He pointed. "That one coyote trickster. That one bear strong." His voice softened. "My boy loved stories of sky." Belle joined him, following his finger. The night felt larger than she could hold, yet strangely safe. "Maybe your boy still listens," she said. James glanced at her, and something shifted in his eyes, less guarded, more human. Weeks passed. James' wounds became scars. The garden grew under his care. The cabin ceased to feel like a place of mourning and began to feel like a home again. Belle found herself humming at her chores, something she hadn't done in years. And though no promises were spoken, a thread wove itself between them, fragile, tentative, yet strong enough to bear the weight of 2 broken hearts beginning to mend. By midsummer, the Mule Mountains baked under a sky so clear it looked scraped clean. The days were hot enough to crack stone, and the nights still carried a desert chill that crept through the cabin's chinks. Bill and James both settled into a rhythm that neither of them had expected. Each morning, James rose before the sun, moving with the deliberate strength of a man reclaiming his body. He split wood in the yard, his axe ringing sharp against juniper. He hauled water from the spring, mended fence rails, and patched the roof with cedar bark until no rain could slip through. Belle would find herself pausing in her chores, watching the sure motion of his arms, the calm patience with which he worked. One afternoon, she found him in the half-dead garden behind the cabin. He was on his knees, turning the soil with a sharpened stick, humming something low in Apache. Roses that had once withered, now stood in neat lines, shaded with woven mats of willow he had lashed together. "You've a better hand at this than I ever did," Belle said from the doorway, a smile tugging at her lips. James looked up, wiping dirt from his hands. "'Twill listens if you treat it right. You hurry, it does. You wait. It gives." Belle tilted her head. "Sounds like you talking about more than dirt." James gave a small shrug. His eyes caught hers briefly, then dropped back to the earth. Trust still moved between them like a skittish animal, sometimes close, sometimes darting away. Yet the cabin filled with quiet signs of companionship. They cooked meals side by side. She showed him how her father had roasted venison with wild sage. He showed her how his people smoked rabbit with moss quiet and ground dried berries into meal. When Belle cut her hands splitting kindling, James cleaned the wound with practiced skill, binding it neatly with a strip of cloth. She caught herself marveling that he, who had once been her patient, now cared for her. Evenings often found them on the porch watching dusk lay purple shadows across the canyons. Belle would talk sometimes about the neighbors who had once courted her friendship, sometimes about her father's patients, who had paid him with chickens or quilts. James listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. One night, Belle confessed softly, "My husband left me for another woman. Told me I was too quiet, too plain, not enough to hold his attention. Ever since, I've wondered what's wrong with me. Jamás bra forward. Man who says such words, he is the one not enough." She laughed lightly, though her throat tightened. "You say that now, but you don't know me." His gaze held her steady and unflinching. "I know you cut me free when others left me for sun and thirst. I know you fight storms alone and still stand. That is enough." The words struck deeper than she expected. For the first time in years, Belle felt a warmth rise that had nothing to do with fire or whiskey. One day, while James worked on the cabin roof, a summer storm rolled sudden out of the mountains. Belle rushed out to call him down, but he was already climbing. Rain slicked the shingles, the wind snapping his braid loose as he hammered boards into place. "You age fall," she shouted over the thunder. James only shook his head, driving another nail. "Roof not wait. Rain always come." When he climbed down, soaked through and grinning faintly, Belle thrust a blanket at him. "You're half mad," she scolded. He shrugged, teeth flashing briefly in something like humor. "Better mad than roof in pieces." Belle shook her head, but couldn't hide her smile. He had done more to make the cabin whole than she had managed in a year of loneliness. The unspoken bond between them showed in small gestures. James sharpened her father's old rifle without being asked, oiling the parts until it gleamed. Belle, in turn, sewed new covers for the bedroll he had patched with hide. Her stitches neat and careful. One evening, as Belle set bread to rise, James brought in a small carved figure shaped from squat, the form of a bird mid-flight. He placed it on the table without explanation. Belle picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth wings. "It's beautiful. Did you make this?" James nodded once. "Beard flies free, strong wings." Belle's throat tightened. She set the carving on the mantel where the firelight caught its wings. "Thank you," she said softly. As the weeks deepened, Belle found herself less guarded. The laughter that had been absent since her husband's betrayal slipped back into her voice. James, though, began to show flashes of the man he had been before tragedy. He says lighter, his silence less heavy. Yet both knew the peace was fragile. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Belle would wake to find James sitting outside, staring into the dark as though listening for footsteps. And sometimes Belle herself lay awake, remembering the day Thomas had walked out, leaving her hollow with shame. But when dawn broke, they faced it together. James split wood. Bill fetched water. They shared coffee strong enough to strip paint and a quiet look that said more than words could. One morning, Belle found James in the yard tying down new beams for the corral. She carried out a plate of corn cakes, setting it on the fence post. "You know," she said, watching him work. "You've done enough. You don't owe me anything more." James tightened the rope, then straightened. His dark eyes studied her for a long moment. "Garden grows," he said slowly. "House stands. They'd paid soon. Then I go." The words landed like a stone in her chest. Bill forced a smile. "If that's what you want." But when she turned away, her hands trembled. She had not realized until then how much she feared the thought of losing him. That evening they sat by the fire in silence. Bill stitched a tear in her skirt. James carved another small figure from wood. At last he spoke. "Bill," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up. "Why you help me truly?" Bill met his gas. She could have said it was duty or her father's teaching, but the truth pressed against her ribs until she let it out. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind," she whispered. "And I couldn't let you die that way." James's hand stilled on the carving knife. Slowly, he nodded as though something in him finally settled. For the first time since they met, Belle felt that the distance between them, the desert of suspicion, grief, and silence, was narrowing. Not gone, not yet, but close enough to cross. The days had settled into a rhythm so steady, Belle almost forgot there was a world beyond her valley. James' quiet presence filled the cabin with a kind of strength she hadn't felt since her father was alive. But peace is never permanent in the desert. The past has a way of riding back into your life. Dust rising behind it. It was a late afternoon when Belle first saw the rider coming up the trail. She was weeding near the garden. Hair skirts dusty when the sound of hooves reached her. At first she thought it might be a passing ranch hand lost or looking for water, but as the figure grew closer, her heart clenched. Thomas, her husband, no, her former husband, though the law had never bothered to make it formal, he rode with the same swagger he'd worn the day he walked out on her, chasing a younger woman and a fortune he never found. His head was tilted low and his coat hung loose over a pistol at his hip. It looked leaner, harder, and meaner than she remembered. Belle wiped her hands on her apron, forcing herself to stand tall. Bill Thomas drawled as he reined in his eyes swept over the cabin, the patched roof, the strong corral rails. Then they landed on her, sharp with something between hunger and sorrow. "Didn't they expect to find you still scratching out a living here?" "This is my home," Belle said evenly. "Was your home," he corrected, swinging down from the saddle. "Your daddy left it to you?" "Sure, but you're a woman alone." "Land's worth something, Bill. And I need it." She crossed her arms, trying to still the tremor in her stomach. "You left your rights behind when you left me." Thomas' mouth twisted. "You always were stubborn. Guess I shouldn't be surprised you clung to this place like a burr." His gaze shifted, narrowing as the door behind her opened. James stepped out, carrying a bucket of water from the spring. He froze when he saw the stranger, every muscle taut. Thomas's eyes flicked over him, taking in the braids, the copper skin, the scars. Well, Thomas said slowly. "So that's it. I ride up here expecting to find my wife still pining and instead I find her shacked up with a goddamn Apache." Bella's breath caught, but she held her ground. "Thomas, lower your voice." He ignored her, stalking closer. "You always made me out the villain, Bill. But this is filth. Do you think you can live with one of them and hold on to your good name? Folks will laugh you out of the county." James set down the bucket carefully, his eyes never leaving Thomas. He didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. Thomas turned on Belle, rage burning through his grin. "You've shamed me for the last time." His hand snapped up as though to strike her. But James was faster. He stepped between them, his hand clamping down on Thomas's wrist like iron. His voice came low, deadly steady. "No." For a moment, the only sound was the wind scraping through the junipers. Thomas tried to jerk free, but James's grip held. Belle saw the fury in her husband's face collapse into something else, fear. "Get your hands off me," Thomas snarled. James released him, but his eyes cut sharp as a knife. Thomas turned to Belle, chest heaving. "So this is what you have sunk to, letting a savage defend your honor." Belle felt something hot and steady rise in her chest. For years, she had let Thomas' words cut her down. But not now. Not in front of James. She lifted her chin. "James isn't defending me because I need it. Is here because I want him here. Is my partner, my man, my choice." The words hung heavy in the air. Thomas' mouth opened, then snapped shut. The color drained from his face, replaced with a blotchy red. He spat into the dust. "You regret this, Belle." He stormed back to his horse, mounting in one motion. Before he rode off, he cast a look at James, a promise of vengeance. Then he kicked the horse hard and disappeared down the trail, dust rising behind him. When Silence returned, Belle let out the breath she had been holding. Her hands trembled, though her face remained composed. James studied her, brow furrowed. "Hayat, husband," she nodded. "Was not anymore. Not in my heart. Not for a long time." She looked straight at James. Her voice steady. "You are the one I claim now." James blinked as though the words were something he hadn't dared him imagine. Then a slow, quiet warmth spread across his face. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. Belle turned away quickly, busying herself with gathering the weeds she had left scattered. Her cheeks burned, but inside she felt a strange, fierce joy. That night, the cabin felt different. James sat across from her at the table, his dark eyes thoughtful as fear light flickered between them. Belle could feel the weight of what she'd said lingering in the room. "You didn't have to speak like that," James said finally, his voice low. "Yes, I did," Belle answered. She folded her hands together tightly. "Eve spent too long letting Thomas make me feel like less, but I'm not less, and I won't hide the truth of what you mean to me." His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. Slowly he nodded. "Then I stand with you. Whatever storm comes," Belle swallowed hard. She had no illusions Thomas was not a man to accept humiliation quietly. Trouble was riding back into their lives, sure as the sunrise. But when she looked across the table at James, she knew she would not face it alone. That night, as the crickets sang and the desert cooled, Belle lay awake listening to James breathe steady on the cot across the room. She thought of Thomas's threat, of the fury in his eyes. She thought, though, of James's hand intercepting that blow before it ever touched her. For the first time since her husband had left her, Belle felt no fear of what the morning might bring. Whatever came, she and Chiefs would meet it together, and in the quiet of that knowledge, she finally slept. The days after Thomas's return dragged heavy with silence. Belle tried to keep her hands busy kneading dough, hanging laundry, mending clothes, but her thoughts circled back to the look in his eyes when he rode away. It was not the look of a man beaten. It was the look of a man lobing. James seemed to sense it, though. Each morning he walked the ridge above the cabin, scanning the trails. He set new snares in the brush, not for rabbits this time, but for men. He moved through the land with quiet purpose. The Apache hunter resurfacing in him after years of grief. Belle watched him one evening as he sharpened the edge of a hatchet by the fire. His hands were steady, his face unreadable. "You think he'll come back," she said finally. James looked up. "Yes." Belle's stomach nodded. "We others? Men like him never ride alone," James said. Belle forced a breath through her nose. She had faced Thomas's temper before, but never with guns at his back. Still, she remembered her father's words. "Fear only has the power you give it." She squared her shoulders. "Then we'll be ready." The preparation was quiet but relentless. James showed Belle how to dig shallow pits along the east trail, covering them with brush so a horse would break a leg if it came too fast. He raked trip lines of rawhide near the corral that would jerk a man off balance. Belle, for her part, cleaned her father's rifle until it gleamed. She practiced loading and firing at a log behind the cabin, her shoulder sore from the recoil, but her aim steadying with each shot. James watched, offering few words, but a nod of approval now and then. At night, when the fire burned low, they spoke little, yet the silence was not empty. It was the silence of two people drawing strength from each other. The attack came at dawn. As James had predicted, Belle was awake already, the kettle just beginning to steam. She heard the tunnel's drum of hooves first, then the sharper clink of spurs, the laughter of men who thought themselves hunters. Her blood went cold. James was already at the door, bow in hand. He had fashioned the arrows himself from cedar shafts, their tips honed sharp. He glanced back at her. Stay low. I'm careful. Belle swallowed, nodded, and took her rifle to the loft. The riders appeared out of the dust. Thomas at the lead with 3 men behind him. One carried a shotgun across his saddle, another a pistol already drawn. Thomas's face was twisted with fury, his pride burning hotter than the morning sun. It rained in just beyond the corral. Belle, he shouted. Come out here now. We settle this once and for all. Belle crouched at the loft window, heart hammering. She could see the sneer on his lips, the greed in his eyes. James stepped out from the cabin's shadow. Calm as stone. Leave, he said simply. Thomas barked a laugh. You don't give orders here, salvaje. This land's mine, and so is she. Belle's hands tightened on the rifle. Something in her snapped. She leaned out just far enough for her voice to carry. This land is mine, Thomas. My father gave it to me, and I will never belong to you again. Thomas' head jerked toward her voice. Rage twisted his features. You pay for that mouth, Belle. He jerked his pistol up. The crack of Belle's rifle split the air. The shot didn't kill him. It wasn't meant to, but it punched the pistol clean from his hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. The other men spurred their horses, charging forward. James moved like smoke. His first arrow thudded into the thigh of the man with the shotgun, dropping him with a scream. The second arrow grazed another's shoulder, enough to send the horse rearing. Belle reloaded fast, her fingers steady, despite the pounding in her chest. She fired again, striking the ground at the hooves of the third rider. The animal reared and threw its rider into the dust. Thomas cursed, scrambling for cover behind a boulder. He drew a second pistol from his belt and fired wildly toward the cabin. Bullets tore through wood, one splinter grazing Belle's cheek. Stay down. James called, but Belle refused to cower. She wiped the blood from her face, lifted the rifle again and took careful aim. She saw Thomas's head rise just above the rock. She fired. The bullet shaved his head clean off and left a gouge in the stone. Thomas ducked back, cursing louder. The fight dragged into a deadly standoff. 2 of Thomas's men lay wounded, groaning in the dust. The third limped away on foot, his horse bolting into the brush. James moved from shadow to shadow, always unseen until the moment he loosed an arrow. Belle covered him with rifle shots, her aim forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. Finally, foul. The only sounds were the wind and the ragged groans of the wounded. Thomas crawled from behind the boulder, blood on his sleeve where one of James's arrows had grazed him. His eyes burned with hatred, but there was fear there, too. He looked from Belle, standing tall in the loft window, to James, bowed and ready. You think you be won? Thomas spat. The law's on my side. Folks will say you are living in sin with a savage. They drive you out. Belle's voice rang steady as a church bell. Let them talk. I'd rather live honest with James than live a lie with you. James stepped closer, arrow aimed square at Thomas's chest. His voice was calm. Final leave. Take your men. If you return, you do not leave again. For a long moment, Thomas stared at him, trembling with rage. Then slowly he raised his hands. Fine, he hissed. But this isn't over. He gathered the wounded with curses and threats, dragging them back to their horses as is. When at last they rode off down the trail, dust swallowing them, Belle lowered her rifle and let her knees buckle. James caught her before she fell, steadying her with hands that were both strong and gentle. You did well, he murmured. Belle looked up at him, her breath shaking. I couldn't have done it without you. For a moment, they just stood there, the desert windsea, carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. And in that silence, Belle realized she no longer felt afraid, not of Thomas, not of the whispers of neighbors, not of the lonely nights ahead. She had chosen her path, and James had chosen to stand beside her. For a long while after the dust settled, neither Belle nor James spoke. The sense in the valley felt heavy, almost holy, like the land itself was catching its breath after the fight. Belle leaned against the cabin wall, her rifle still warm in her hands. She could hear her own pulse louder than the crickets in the brush. James stood a few steps away, Belle lowered, scanning the horizon to make sure Thomas and his men were truly gone. Only when the last hoofbeats faded into the canyon, did he turn back to her. His eyes softened as they met hers. "Obed," he said simply. Belle let out a shaky breath. For now, she glanced at him, a smile tugging faintly at her lips. "But I think you scared him worse than I ever did." James gave a small, quiet grunt, which might have been his version of a laugh. The days that followed were filled with work, though not the frantic kind of preparing for war. Now it was the work of rebuilding. James helped Belle drag the splintered boards from where bullets had punched through the cabin wall. Together they patched holes with fresh-cut pine. Belle replanted the garden where hooves had torn the soil, and James repaired the corral rail that had snapped under the weight of a frightened horse. Every task they did side by side, wordless sometimes, other times with short exchanges that carried more meaning than long speeches. A rhythm set in steady, certain, the kind of rhythm that felt like life could stretch on and on. One evening, as Belle stirred beans over the fire, James sat whittling by the hearth. He shaped another small carving, the wood turning into the figure of a wolf mid-step. He handed it to her without explanation. Belle turned it over in her palm. "And what does this one mean?" Jame's gaze was steady. "Wolf walks not alone, stronger in pack," her chest tightened. She set the carving beside the bird he'd given her weeks before. Two figures now, side by side, glowing in the firelight. As the nights grew cooler, with the first whispers of autumn, Belle found herself sitting with Jim on the porch after supper. They would watch the stars appear one by one, the air scented with sagebrush and sket smoke. One such night, Belle spoke the thought that had been pressing in her chest for days. "James," she said so softly, "he'll never stop hating us for this. Thomas, maybe he won't come back himself, but he'll talk. Folks will whisper. They'll call me worse names than I've already heard." James looked at her, his profile etched in silver by the moon. "You afraid?" Belle was quiet a long time. Then she shook her head. "Not with you here." For the first time, James reached out and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, scarred, but his touch was gentle. "You choose this life?" he asked. Belle's throat tightened. She looked at him, on the man who had nearly died in the sun, who now stood tall in her yard like the very earth belonged to him. "Yes," she whispered. "I choose you." Something in his gaze broke open, then all the grief and solitude he had carried folding into a new kind of strength. He leaned closer, and Belle met him halfway. Their lips touched, tentative at first, then with the certainty of two souls who had been walking wounded for too long. When they parted, Belle rested her forehead against his, she was smiling through tears she hadn't realized were there. The next morning, dawned bright and clear. A sky washed clean by the storm of yesterday's violence, Belle woke to the sound of James already outside, splitting wood. She stepped onto the porch, watching him work. The sight no longer filled her with worry or curiosity, but with a quiet joy that this was her life now. "Breakfast will be ready soon," she called. He paused, wiped sweat from his brow, and gave a small nod. "Good." And just like that, the ordinary felt extraordinary. Weeks slipped into months. The valley healed along with them. The garden flourished under James's care. Rows of corn and beans, pumpkins swelling orange in the dust. Belle began tending to neighbors again, called upon for her skill with herbs and steady haunts, a child with a fever, a ranch hand with a broken arm, people came. And though some whispered about the Apache who lived under her roof, none could deny the good they did together. Sometimes James would ride out hunting, returning with deer slung across his horse. Sometimes Belle rode with him. The two of them moving through the wild country as if they belonged there. Not settler, not warrior, just two people who had found a place. One evening, as autumn painted the hills in moat, Belle stood with James at the edge of the field. The sun was sinking low, spilling fire across the horizon. She leaned against the fence rail, breathing deep of the cool air. "You know," she said softly. "When Thomas left me, I thought my life was over. He thought I was broken. But maybe I had to lose everything to find this." James turned toward her. His voice was quiet, but certain. "We both, Lucy, we both fine." Belle reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. For the first time since her father's passing, she felt whole. That night, the cabin glowed with warmth. The fire crackled, throwing light on the carvings lined up on the mantel. The bird, the wolf, and now a third James had given her a small figure of a woman standing tall. "What's this one?" Belle asked, touching it with a swallow. Jamés I softened. Estroneart. Belle felt tears prick her eyes. She set the carving carefully between the others, then turned and lost him. The cabin no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a beginning. And so it was, that in a quiet valley of the Mule Mountains, where once there had been only grief and loneliness, two broken lives were mended. James, the Apache warrior who had lost everything, and Belle, the woman cast aside by the men who once claimed her, had found each other. They did not speak of forever, for the desert taught that nothing was promised. But as they worked side by side, laughed, argued, and planned for the coming winter, they carried the certainty that whatever storms rose, they would face them together. And when the nights grew long and the wind howled down the canyon, the little cabin stood fast, its walls patched, its garden alive, and its hearth burning bright with the fire of a love reborn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. I'm truly glad you stayed with me. Your support means so much. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this.